Welcome, everyone. It is 1 o'clock in the East, 10 a.m. in the West. Wherever you're joining us from, good day. Thank you very much for being a part of this webinar on national guidance related to munitions and explosives of concern, hosted by the United States Committee on the Marine Transportation System in partnership with the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement and the Coast Guard. I'm Larry Schooler. I'll be your moderator for today. It's my privilege to be assisting the government with this important session today. We're here primarily to give you an informational overview of the munitions and explosives of concern national guidance and the process that underpinned its development. Also give you the chance to ask clarifying questions regarding that guidance to help inform comments you may later submit to the Federal Register, give you some guidance on how to submit that commentary to the Register on the guidance, and perhaps identify some topic areas where you'd benefit from additional clarification, engagement, and/or future meetings. We're going to record today's session so that folks who aren't able to join us live can receive it later. It'll be distributed to participants following the webinar and available on the CMTS website. I want to note that we're scheduled to go for 90 minutes so that we have enough time for questions to be answered, but it's hard to predict how things will go, and depending on how many questions we have, we may end a little early or even extend a little bit past our designated time. So we'll see how that goes. Without further ado, I want to introduce the Acting Director of CMTS, Brian Tetreault, for some opening remarks. Hey, Brian.
Hi, thank you, Larry, and welcome everybody. I would like to welcome you to this webinar sponsored by the U.S. Committee on the Marine Transportation, the CMTS, on the guidance that we've drafted on munitions and explosives of concern, you may hear them referred to as MECs or MECs, that have been encountered during offshore energy development. I'm the Acting Executive Director of the CMTS. Just a little background on the CMTS. It's a cabinet-level interagency maritime policy coordinating body that was established by presidential directive in 2004 and by congressional legislation. We coordinate the efforts of over 24 federal agencies that have a role in the marine transportation system. Our role in coordinating interagency efforts is why we're involved in this specific issue.
Brian, I hate to do this. Unfortunately for us, the audio from your end is coming in a little faint. If there's a way for you to adjust your source microphone.
Let me do that right now.
Just want to make sure we get to hear everything you're saying.
Is this any better?
It is. Thank you.
Okay, now I need to be able to hear. How's that?
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. And I will continue on with my prepared remarks. We're involved in this issue because in 2020, BSEE, the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, approached us. BSEE is a CMTS member, to ask for help in coordinating the many different agencies that have overlapping offshore equities and jurisdictions surrounding munitions and explosives of concern that were being discovered as offshore wind energy was being developed. The CMTS is an existing framework to facilitate interagency coordination, starting with our coordinating board, which consists of senior leadership from our member agencies. The coordinating board establishes various working teams to do work on specific issues. And in September 2021, they established what we call the Offshore Energy Facilitation Task Team to develop national level guidance on this issue. This is the value and the power that the CMTS has brought to this effort. We have an existing structure for coordination and the commitment of senior agency leadership that are represented by the coordinating board principals to the process that developed this guidance. Before we step in, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank a few folks here. I'd like to thank the co-leads of this team, Candace Nackman from the Coast Guard and Jonathan Fraser from BSEE for their leadership. And then to CMTS staff lead, Michael Hurd-Snow, for all the work that he's done. Also for all the participants from all the various agencies that have been involved in this. And then in particular, I'd like to call out the MEC subject matter experts from the Department of Defense who provided invaluable expertise on munitions, which are far outside the normal experience areas that the CMTS has. So with that, welcome again, and thank you and look forward to your participation. We are really anticipating your questions and strongly encourage you to make comments to the docket. Information has been provided in the chat on how to do that, and we'll also cover that as part of this webinar. So thanks again, and I look forward to comments and the presentation. Thanks.
Brian, thank you very much. Appreciate the overview. I'm joined today also by some colleagues at Kearns and West helping to facilitate, including Casey Hoffman, who is overseeing technical support for us. And if she's available, I wanted to have her step us through some technical instructions for the day. Casey.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Larry. So today our format will be using a Zoom webinar. If you have any technical difficulties throughout, you are able to get in contact me through a couple of different ways. You can Zoom chat me. You can also email me at choffman@kearnswest.com, or I'll add my number in the chat if you want to send me a quick text and we can troubleshoot that way. Throughout this presentation, participants will be muted and you will not be able to unmute yourself, but there will be a public input opportunity at the end of our presentations where you will have the ability to provide feedback and ask questions through a Q&A session. You can do that through a couple of different ways. You can use the raise hand function at the bottom, and Larry will be minding the queue and facilitating that. You may also use the Q&A pod to ask a question, and our panelist and Larry will sort through those and answer those verbally. And then we will also be facilitating the unmute and mute function if you want to ask a question verbally as well. So there are different opportunities throughout today's session to provide that public comment. And I think that's it on my end. I'll be providing some information in the chat on how to contact me if you have any troubles throughout today's session. And I will turn it back over to Larry.
Thanks, Casey, very much. Morgan Nackman is also supporting our work on the Kearns and West side. And I wanted you to know that in addition to the recording, we will be taking detailed notes and develop meeting summaries that you'll be able to find on the CMTS website, thanks to Morgan and others' efforts there. I did go over the webinar objectives there at the top of the meeting. We do have a slide just to reiterate what those are. Again, to share an informational overview of the national guidance related to munitions and explosives of concern, to field your questions as it relates to how to make comments subsequently in the Federal Register on national guidance, give you instructions on how to do those comments, and then potentially identify some topic areas for further exploration down the road. So again, the primary purpose today is to allow you all to ask those clarifying questions that will make it easier for you to provide informed commentary on the guidance. We're not intending for this to be an opportunity to provide formal public comment. That's for the Federal Register itself. I did want to note if there are any members of the media in attendance. I was a former colleague of yours. This meeting is primarily to provide an informational overview of the guidance and address those questions. So please consider information from members of the public not for attribution unless the person has given you direct permission to be quoted. If you're interested in an interview with any of the governmental personnel, it'd be great if you could contact Offshore Energy at cmts.gov. Again, Offshore Energy at cmts.gov for any on-the-record interviews. Few basic ground rules that we just wanted to cover to make sure we stay on track. Let me actually go out of order. Forgive me. Let me cover the agenda first. We've done the welcome and opening remarks, and we're about to get to an overview from our partners in the federal government who will present that. Then we'll have a section on how to provide formal comment on this guidance, then take your questions, and then wrap things up with some next steps at the end. Again, we're scheduled to go till 2:30 p.m. Eastern, 11:30 a.m. Pacific, but if we finish early, we will finish early, and if we need to go a little bit past that, we can do that as well. I think now I've got some ground rules to cover. We want to just make sure folks stay on task and on track with the agenda, that your participation is respectful to both your fellow participants and the panelists, that your comments are focused and delivered concisely. Share with us, if you don't mind, your name and affiliation when you speak, just so we can keep track. And of course, we want to make sure we can hear you. So please speak clearly into whatever device you might be using to listen. Well, it's great to have all nearly 50 attendees with us right now. And for those of you watching on recording, thanks for joining that way. I think we're at this point ready to get into the overview of the national guidance. And I think we're going to kick things off with Michael Hurd-Snow. Michael.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Larry. So it's great to have you all here today. Good morning to those on the West Coast. Good afternoon to everyone here on the East Coast. My name is Michael Hurd-Snow. I am the staff lead for the Offshore Energy Facilitation Task Team at the U.S. Committee on the Marine Transportation System. You'll be hearing from me today about the national guidance that we've just released for public comment in the Federal Register, as well as from my co-leads on this team from the Coast Guard and BSEE. Next slide, Pete, please. So again, just a little bit about the information that we're going to go through today. I'm going to start with talking about the issues surrounding munitions and explosives of concern, the background on why we're here today, what this issue is. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the CMTS, the structure of our agency and why we were brought in to address this issue, the Offshore Energy Task Team specifically, and then jump into the national guidance itself. I'll go over the purpose of the guidance, why we decided that guidance was the best way to move forward on this issue, the structure of the guidance itself, and then we're going to end with how to provide public comment. That's really what we're hoping to get out of here, is to provide you all with the background and the information to help us make this a better document and move forward on addressing this issue. So next slide, please. So first, our MECs, or munitions and explosives of concern. What are they? What is the issue? So MEC is a very broad term. It includes any objects that may pose an explosive safety risk. And when you're thinking about offshore development, the first thing you think of is usually not explosives or munitions. But up until the mid-70s, with the passing of the Ocean Dumping Act, it was one of the regular methods of disposal by the US government for expired munitions armaments was to dump them offshore. There's also a lot of munitions that have ended up through acts of war, through World War II, and through live fire exercises. The photo here is just an example of what these actually look like when they are in the water. So this is a 1,000-pound bomb that was discovered in Lake Michigan. This is not exclusively on the Atlantic seaboard or in the Pacific. It's in most of our waterways. And this is something that you really don't want to be hitting when you're developing an offshore wind farm or laying a cable or a pipeline or anything else. So if you could go to the next slide. So part of the problem with the munitions and explosives of concern is we know that they've been dumped offshore. We know that there were significant amount of munitions that are especially off the Atlantic seaboard, where there's the highest concentration, just due to the proximity of where those munitions were stored and the availability of disposing of them. The problem with that is these were a lot of operations that were happening in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. There isn't a significant amount of historic records of exactly how many munitions are offshore, exactly where they are. We do know that they come up in fishing nets regularly. We do know that when we do surveys, we find them. There was this continuous disposal as armaments aged out. It was one of the most convenient and cost-effective ways to get rid of large amounts of munitions quickly. Once they were offshore, there's significant amounts of ocean processes, storms, winds, waves, currents that move them around. So even if we do know where they were dumped originally, we don't know where we are now. There's this unknown scale of threat until we actually start going out there and looking for them. On top of that, there is these really overlapping and complicated jurisdictions. You don't need to see the details of this chart, but this is one of the official charts that's provided by NOAA of the divvying up of offshore territorial jurisdictions. The laws act slightly differently in each one of these areas. There's different agencies, states, local authorities, federal government. that have various levels of authority at different stages offshore. So where you find this MEC is going to have an impact on what the regulations surrounding it are. To make that more complicated, there isn't any clear regulatory authority for any single agency at this moment. There's lots of delegations that impact the offshore environment. Anybody who works with offshore development is, I'm sure, very aware of that. But part of this is when Congress has made these delegations, they generally have been narrow delegations for a specific purpose. There's no clear, broad, general authority offshore like there is on land, where you have states that make up that general police powers and broad delegations. And also part of when you're finding these during a development, there's not a clear emergency. An emergency is kind of the exception to that rule. In the event of any type of emergency, the Coast Guard has incredibly clear jurisdictional power. There's very clear authorities and methods that click in and start to go into effect. So this is kind of the background of these threats right now, where you're coming in and when we're trying to develop and figure out what to do when these are, discovered in a survey. If you could go to the next slide. So there's this complicated background. And so where does the CMTS come into this? So again, we're talking about this complicated marine background. We've started there. When you compare that to almost any other type of development area, if it's something impacting, airplanes or rail or highways, you have very clear agencies that are consolidated into a single body that has oversight and coordination. In the marine environment, that's just not the case. There's over 30 different federal agencies that have overlapping and interacting jurisdictions over almost every aspect of anything that impacts the marine environment. Next slide, please. And so this is just a graphical representation of that same issue. This is a regular report the CMTS sends over to Congress. At the top are federal agencies, across the side are different equities and authorities. We, again, don't need to go into this in detail, but the X's give you an idea of how these agencies overlap in multiple different issues, and trying to map out this authority is not an easy task. Next slide. And so the CMTS was created originally by presidential directive to be a cabinet level committee to work to bring these agencies together and to coordinate this work as it interacts in various issues on out on the marine environment. So we do this through a variety of different ways, mainly through our member agencies. We were given our congressional authorization in 2012 through the Coast Guard Marine Transportation Act. And if you could go to the next slide, this is a quick overview of our cabinet board. So we have 16 cabinet members that make up the crux of the CMTS's authority. And underneath those cabinet members are the dozens of agencies that we work with every day to coordinate the effort of federal regulations offshore. Next slide. So within the CMTS, we have our cabinet committee. Underneath our cabinet committee is our coordinating board, which is made up of those sub-agencies. And then at the working level, we have the executive secretariat, which our acting director, Mr. Tetro, gave the opening remarks today. And that's where a lot of the day-to-day work gets done, and that we work with the staff level members of all of these agencies. Next slide. And so these agency teams are set up into various issues. We work on everything from increasing the safety and security of Arctic marine shipping to increasing marine science and technology development in intermodal waterways and the dams and locks and safety and security, lots of different various interacting issues. One of which is, of course, this team here, which is the offshore energy development team. Next slide. Which I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Candace Nachman, to talk more about the establishment of.
Thank you so much, Michael. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to those of you on the West Coast. So as you can see here, the Offshore Energy Facilitation Task Team was established. It was established back in September 2021 at the request of the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, BSEE. As Michael just mentioned, task teams within the CMTS are typically established upon request from one of the member agencies. The team is currently co-led by myself, Candace Nackman. I'm representing the United States Coast Guard, and by Mr. Jonathan Frazier, who is from BSEE, and of course, with the stellar support and engagement that we get from Michael at CMTS. In establishing this team, pretty much everyone realized that and knew that there was already a lot of different interagency efforts and groups working to achieve our nation's offshore energy wind goals. However, none of those groups or efforts were specifically addressing the issue of munitions and explosives of concern that developers were starting to find in their outer continental shelf lease areas. And therefore, this Offshore Energy Facilitation Task Team was created with the mission of facilitating the development of federal guidance on munitions and explosives of concern found in offshore wind energy lease areas. Additionally, should any new or emerging issues arise in this space that are not being addressed by other interagency efforts, our team would likely tackle those as well. Next slide, please. So here you see just a brief history of our team. As I mentioned, we were officially established in September 2021, which was done following a federal roundtable where the relevant agencies discussed the issue, and the CMTS was able to get buy-in from all of those in attendance. About a month later, in October 2021, the CMTS hosted a listening session with the offshore wind industry, as well as with representatives from MEC disposal companies. This was an opportunity for the agencies to hear about concerns as well as capabilities from the offshore wind developers and their third-party companies that conduct MEC disposal and removal activities. A recording of this October 2021 industry listening session is available on the CMTS website for anyone who is interested in going back and listening to it. As the task team continued to explore the issue, we identified that currently, as Michael and others have mentioned, there is no clear statutory or regulatory authority empowering any federal agency to directly regulate, approve, or prohibit response activities related to munitions and explosives of concern on the outer continental shelf. So given that, we worked collaboratively to produce a draft national guidance document. As part of that process, we held a federal agency tabletop exercise earlier this year, where we reviewed multiple scenarios from simpler ones, such as finding a MEC, but the developer can easily microsite around it, leaving the device in place, to more complex scenarios, such as a MEC device being pulled up onto the deck of a vessel that is out conducting survey activities for the eventual construction of an offshore wind farm. And then finally, we released the draft national guidance document just about 2 weeks ago for you all to review and provide comment to us. Next slide, please. In developing this national guidance document, we really had two overarching purposes. First, we wanted to outline a decision logic and framework for offshore wind energy lessees should they find MEC devices during the process of developing and constructing their offshore facilities. And we developed this framework based on Department of Defense best practices. Second, we wanted to provide an interagency reporting structure, timeline, and procedures. To that end, the national guidance document takes a stepwise approach, and we explore 3 stages. First, a lessee encounters a suspicious device that could potentially be a munition or explosive of concern. Following assessment, the lessee determines the device is in fact a MEC. And then finally, the lessee takes action to deal with the MEC. If you could please just click one more time. So here you can see an outline of the contents of the national guidance document. And in just a moment, Jonathan is going to walk through some of our decision trees. However, I'd like to just mention a couple of things related to the document itself right now. First, throughout the document, we explain timelines for when and to whom developers or their third-party contractors should contact in the event of finding a MEC. We also included an appendix in the draft national guidance document prepared by the Department of Defense regarding minimum qualifications for personnel conducting munitions and explosives of concern related activities. I'd now like to turn the floor over to my colleague, Jonathan.
Hey, thank you very much, Candace. I appreciate it. If you go to the next slide, please. So this is also included in the Federal Register notice, but we wanted to talk a little bit about essentially two phases of the process that is outlined in the guidance. To start with, Michael highlighted the fact that there could be an emergency situation, and that does have strong regulatory authorities built around such situations where if a munition were recovered to a vessel, as an example. And so in that type of discovery that we have here in the flow chart on the top, you can see in those situations, then that respective developer or anybody in the maritime space will contact the Coast Guard via Channel 16, and then they would be able to, the Coast Guard would be able to also reach out for technical assistance from the Department of Defense. And there's a lot of well-established practices in that space. What this guidance is primarily focused on is when we're talking about commercial development for offshore energy and those non-emergency situations where the munition is still on the surface, the subsurface. So what we have broken down here is essentially three different categories. So we have pre-construction surveys, seabed disturbing activities, and then post-construction surveys. As outlined in the guidance for pre-construction surveys, the leaseholders would not be actually doing any type of development at this stage. They're only conducting the surveys, but if they find and confirm a munition or explosive of concern, then they would provide us a notification within 48 hours. If they're actually doing seabed disturbing activities such as laying cable or installing a turbine as two examples, then we would require that notification within 24 hours. And then finally, if it's a post-construction survey, something such as if they are doing a survey of their cable corridor, which is required to be done on a regular basis, and they were to come across an identified confirmed munition, then we'd require notification within 48 hours. Stepping through that process, you can see each one of those, Bessie and BOEM, if they find this during pre-construction surveys, we may impose requirements on that. If they find a munition during seabed disturbing activities, Bessie does have authority to issue an administrative order as necessary. And then finally, we have, if they identified a munition while they're doing post-construction surveys, we also, as Bessie, have the ability to issue an administrative order. The next step that the leaseholder would go through is they would determine if microsighting, or in other words, avoidance of the munition is possible. If they can avoid that munition, then that is always the preferred option by all parties. And you can see in the top right-hand section, if they can avoid it, then that would be what the leaseholder would do, and the process would end. If the lessee conducted evaluation and determined they could not microsight around the munition, then they would conduct a hazard analysis and develop a munition response plan. And then we would move on to phase two. If you go to the next slide, please. In phase two, both Bessie and BOEM would receive a submission that the leaseholder would provide to us demonstrating that they cannot avoid the confirmed MEC and it is not feasible. Both of the agencies would go through analysis of environmental data, such as proximity to benthic habitat, as well as safety data, the safety avoidance distances, and munition characteristics, etc. And then Bessie and BOEM would have the authority to determine if microsighting was feasible or if not. If we determine as the agencies that it is feasible to microsight around the item, then we would require that of the leaseholder. If not, then Bessie would contact the Maritime Operational Threat Response, which is an organization within the United States Coast Guard that is a facilitator by specialty. They deal with a lot of facilitation on international incidents such as piracy, et cetera, and they're used to working with many federal partners as well as international partners to resolve complex issues. So Bessie would request the motor to convene within 5 days of making the determination that microsighting is not feasible. The motor would then be activated, and the federal partners would review the response plan facilitated by the motor. Bessie would then provide all the questions and comments to the lessee within 24 hours of the motor coordination meeting. Next, the lessee would provide a response to the comments and questions of all the federal partners. Once the comments have been satisfied, then the leaseholder will conduct the munitions response operations, and then they would provide the post-activity reports, and that would close the process. So again, very general stepwise, but we just want to talk about the phase 1 and phase 2 of the process. You can find more details, of course, broken down into the guidance. And that is all for me. Next slide, please. So Michael, I believe I'm passing this back to you.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan. Yeah, so we're just going to briefly go over some details of how to actually comment on the document. So next slide, please. So the document's available in a couple different places. The first is in the Federal Register. There is a notice of availability that is at this link. I believe was also shared in the chat below. You can also search CMTS and it will pop up in the Federal Register itself. Through that Federal Register notice, you can comment on the document. That'll also take you to the official docket at regulations.gov. The document is available there for you to review, and that's also where comments will be received and formally posted. The document is also available on our website, which has links to this as well, both to download the document and back to where we're receiving comments. Next step, or slide, sorry. So just going to quickly run through what you'll see when you go there. This is our posting in the Federal Register. If you go to the next slide and next. So this box down here below is where you can download the document. If you click that hyperlink there, it will give you a copy of the actual guidance itself to review. The full guidance isn't in the Federal Register text itself. We felt that that would take away from the structure of the document and not be as helpful for us or for any of you while reviewing it. Next slide. And next. So at the very top in this big bar, there is the submit a formal comment button. If you click that, next slide, it'll take you to a page where you can either type up your comments or you can upload files if you have a formal letterhead or a formal document that you would like to submit to us. If you submit it through there, we will receive those comments. Next slide. And this is just showing you all where our website is, and the very first hyperlink at the top of the website is where another place where you can download the document or go to the docket. Our website is cmts.gov. So once you submit those formal comments, next slide. Oh, never mind, that's a questionnaire. Sorry, back. Once you submit those formal comments, we will receive all of that. That will come to us at the CMTS. We are going to review everything that is submitted to us. We are going to use that to formalize a final version of this guidance document, which will again be published both on the CMTS website, distributed through the various channels that we have, and published in the Federal Register. We're going to try to address every comment that we receive and use that to fold back into the guidance document itself, and then also inform future tabletop exercises and other outreach events. Now, next slide.
Michael, thank you very much. It's like we're a newscast. Thanks. Thanks for all of the presenters, Michael, Candace, and Jonathan, for great information. Also, thanks to Brian. We're going to pivot to questions and answers now. I do want to note Dan Quinton's note in the chat requesting a copy of the slides. And Michael, if I'm not mistaken, I think this was going to be posted on the website, but I'm not sure if the slide deck in and of itself was going to be posted and or whether or not it could be sent out. Can you clarify that?
Yeah, we are definitely planning on posting the slide deck as well as a copy of this recording on the CMTS website, and we will distribute it out to everyone who's registered for the webinar. So, thank you.
Very good. Yeah, thanks for that. And Dan, thanks for the questions. So we'll take questions a couple of different ways. If you'd like to raise a hand and ask the question verbally, please do so. You can also type it into the Q&A function, which is in the sort of left center part of the lower bar here on Zoom webinar. And you can also drop a message, as Dan did, into the chat, and we'll see it there as well. So a couple of different avenues for you to use for these questions. Again, these are meant to help clarify presentation content and guidance content, as opposed to it being a public comment opportunity. So we look forward to your questions, whatever they may be. And we are at the moment standing by for our first question. I'm going to take this as a sign that Michael, Jonathan, and Candace should be given an award for most informative and clear presentation in modern history. But Jeffrey Brewer has submitted a question to us via chat. His question is, are there plans in place if the site needs to be cleaned up? Are there plans in place if the site needs to be cleaned up? I think we'll drop the screen share here and focus on our panelists who are in place to try to answer these questions. So I'm not sure which of our folks want to take this one on, but Jeffrey's put it in the chat.
Hey, Larry, I think I'll get that one correct. So as far as any type of man-made hazard holistically, but today we're talking about munitions and explosives of concern. But for any type of development, the idea preferred method is always avoidance. So there is no cleanup efforts that are being required of the leaseholder for all their site to remove all these items. They want to install their equipment around as much as possible.
Thank you very much. Let me turn to a second question that's in the chat. I just want to note that I do have a couple of questions that were submitted ahead of time during registration, and I will cover those. So if you pre-submitted, we'll get there. But Robin Broadley asks, are there to be any guidance on microsighting distances?
So one large aspect we haven't talked about in detail because it's not the intended part of the guidance, but part of the process that the leaseholders go through overall is in part of the construction operations plan is they have to identify munitions and explosives of concern in addition to any other man-made hazard that may be out there while they're developing their lease. And so with that being said, these folks will provide BOEM, and Bessie also participates in the review of what's called a desktop study, where they look at all the historic activity, but also what intended activities they plan to do on their lease. And with that also included is avoidance distances respective to what the operation is. So for example, if you're installing a cable, there's a safe distance for doing that operation comparatively to driving a pilot. So that's where we find those distances. And that would be part of the evaluation that Bessie and BOEM would do if a leaseholder says, hey, you know what, we believe that we cannot microsite around this item. They would provide all that analysis and that would be part of it.
Thanks, Jonathan. And I'm sure this goes without saying, but if folks hear an answer to their question and need further clarification, just let us know, either with a raise hand or further chat. I'm going to turn to the question and answer pod, so to speak. We've got some questions submitted that way. First from Robert Mills, who asks, is a risk assessment required to assess whether munitions left in situ after microsighting are likely to migrate, possibly toward installed assets?
Yes, that would be part of the risk assessment analysis.
Thanks, Jonathan. Scott Wilson asked, how soon before the guidance is finalized and what process is currently available for MEC mitigation?
So as far as the guidance being finalized, Michael talked about the steps. We would not be able to give you a hard and fast timeline. We certainly do understand that operations are taking place offshore currently, and I can say across the federal partnership, everyone is very motivated to get this done, but we want to get it done right. So once we receive the public comments back, we're going to integrate those as much as practical and get this out as soon as possible. Still generally today, obligations for lease activities are to be done in a safe and environmentally responsible manner. That is always the expectation. And so the guidance that we're providing right now, particularly for all of the initial analysis that is provided to BOEM, they have a fantastic studies that are cited in this guidance document as well that talk about how they even identify the risk to their respective site. And that is all under current review and discussion with both Bessie and BOEM and other federal partners as necessary.
Thank you very much for that. Let me turn to another question in the question and answer pod, which says much of this guidance focuses on what happens when munitions, MEC, and UXO are identified, and action from there. But the question is, the phase 1 flowchart only classifies the real first step as discovery. Can you please elaborate on the expected processes to be followed prior to any survey efforts in this discovery stage?
Yep. So, Michael, if we can find this, we'll add it into the notes. But we reference a study that is that was done by BOEM back in 2017 that talks about all the initial phases of identification. I think that's what the question is really geared to, and we'll reference that here in the chat.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. I do want to add on to that the real focus in the national guidance is this specific area where there isn't clear authority or clear requirements that are already existing on offshore wind farms and other offshore energy projects. We didn't want to reiterate every requirement that already exists. So where there is already clear authority that BOEM and BSEE are requiring, such as going out and doing surveys before construction begins, we didn't want to go back into all of that in detail since there is already a clear requirement there.
Thanks to you both for that. We do have a member of our audience who has a hand raised. I believe Jerry Barnes is, let's see. I believe Jerry Barnes, it's a 757 number. And if you can press *6 to unmute yourself, we should be able to bring you here in. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, good afternoon. Again, this is Jerry Barnes from Dominion Energy. And I was curious about how the task force or BSEE envisions a scenario where developer has, we presently have over 100 confirmed UXOs, and the process that's laid out seems more appropriate for like a one-off scenario versus, a high density of UXOs within your cable corridors or lease area.
So thank you very much for the question, Jerry. I think that your situation is quite unique and is going to be interesting. Part of it too that we have to consider is what all you guys have proposed as your available munition response options in your construction operations plan. So for those purposes, I think that we could maybe have another conversation, but since this is a recorded session, particularly on the holistic guidance, I would not want to get into specifics of your lease operations and development.
Yeah, good copy, Jonathan. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And thank you, Jerry. Let me turn to a question in the Q&A lineup here. This again from Scott Wilson. Will an explosives safety submission be required for MEC disposition similar to current requirements at the Department of Defense? Will an explosive safety submission be required for MEC disposition similar to DoD requirements?
Unfortunately, I'm not familiar with the DoD submission that you're referring to, so I apologize about that. But certainly, as part of the general framework, yes, safety is paramount to doing any of these operations, and that would be expected to be part of the munitions response plan.
Thanks, Jonathan. Turning to a question in both the chat and the answer Q&A queue from Michael Lewis. He says, and I apologize for not knowing this acronym, what is the expectation for MOTR coordination with a project where numerous MEC are expected to be over a period of time? Would that coordination occur each time an MEC is prepped to be commissioned or moved? So forgive me for not knowing MOTR, folks.
That's okay, Larry. So that is the motor, which I touched on briefly, which is a specialized facilitator that deals with all sorts of international maritime incidents. In a situation like that, where for what I'm hearing from the question is, there's anticipation, there's a lot of complicated munition locations where they are unable to microsite. That would be something that the developer would need to provide to us as soon as possible so they could work with us as a federal partnership to evaluate what that is. With those types of situations, obviously, we still have to think about the day-to-day environment, making sure that it's appropriate to conduct an operation with the parameters of things like the weather, but also marine mammals and migratory species. So not to dodge the question, but I think it'd be part of his column A, early discussion about the general oversight plan, but as well as, once you get to those operational phases, making sure that's done responsibly, even on a daily basis, I don't think is outside the realm.
Thanks, Jonathan, very much. Let me turn to a question from Edward LeBlanc. He says, does the CMTS intend to hold a tabletop exercise, for example, with the offshore energy industry to work through the guidance, either prior to or shortly after the final guidance is published?
I can take that one. And yes, we do. We are. And we will be reaching out to all the stakeholders to try to figure out a time that works for everyone and bring both the federal partners and the industry partners in to work through that together.
Great, thanks. I want to just turn to a quick question that was in the chat from Jeffrey Brewer, who asked, what agency did you contact at the Department of Defense for information on munitions and explosives of concern?
Yeah, definitely. So at the CMTS, we work with numerous partners over at the Department of Defense. Major General Graham of the U.S. Army Corps was our coordinating board chair for the majority of the development of this guidance, and he was briefed on that regularly. We've worked with the Director of Munitions and Safety with the U.S. Army. The Joint Chiefs of Staff sit on the CMTS board. We've also worked with the Assistant Secretary of Defense's front office and the DDESB, the Department of Defense Explosive Safety Board. We've had multiple levels of review across lots of different offices. We've briefed out both the U.S. Navy and the oceanographer of the Navy. Like I said, multiple levels of review with multiple offices throughout the entire process.
Thanks very much, Michael. Just a reminder to folks, when you hear your question answered, if there's more that you want to get clarified, you certainly can do so orally. If you raise a hand, I'll be happy to accommodate you that way, or just add something to the chat or the Q&A if you need some further clarification. Turning back to the Q&A queue with Charles' question, are there recommendations on things to be aware of while doing close to seafloor survey with sonar or EM systems, like known trigger sources to avoid accidental detonation, if any? I'm well aware that it's variable. Are there recommendations on things to be aware of while doing close to seafloor survey with sonar EM systems, like known trigger sources to avoid accidental detonation, if any?
Yep. So the response to that honestly goes back to the desktop study, which is, again, part of the requirement as part of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management's construction operations plan phase, and as well as conducting their site operations. The desktop study, I mentioned cable laying, but it also covers any type of survey activity as well.
Thank you, Jonathan. Over to a question from John, who says, hello, thank you to the CMTS for this guide. If an MEC is lifted and shifted, very catchy phrase there, does it then become the developer's responsibility to monitor the that MEC for any length of time? If an MEC is lifted and shifted, does it then become the developer's responsibility to monitor that MEC for any length of time?
So it's a great question. I think one of those things that's going to be dependent upon characteristics of the location as well as the munition itself. So part of the analysis, again, referencing the desktop study, we do talk about migration, or the ability of the munition to migrate based on its location. Certainly, we'd want to make sure that the operator is aware if it could possibly migrate and then get entangled in some of its scour protection, as one example. Right. So certainly we want to make sure that that is a responsibility the leaseholder is doing. But as far as, long-term, monitoring of it, that would seriously be on a case-by-case basis as far as what level that monitoring would be. But certainly the expectation is if the leaseholder goes and does any more seabed disturbing activity, that they ensure safety of their personnel for that operation. Also to note too, part of the notification requirements, and we've gotten fantastic energetic responses back from NOAA and others. They want to make sure that when these are possibly identified, that they're charted, and the general maritime community knows where these locations are as well.
Thanks, Jonathan. I'm going to turn to one additional question in the queue, and then I am going to ask a couple of questions that were pre-submitted before the webinar in the registration process. This question says, The Carton et al. 2017 publication referenced as clear guidance specifically states that its proposed process has not been tested, and Boehm and Bessie would have to test this proposed procedure before implementation. There's not been any specific follow-up studies or publications stating that the Carton et al. Procedures have been thoroughly tested and certified. Is this going to happen? And if so, when?
Sorry, if you can just give me 1 minute, I'm reading the question again.
Yeah. Feel a little bit like the late Alex Trebek. You know, there's those questions that no one could answer. Beep, beep, beep.
So as far as tested and certified, I don't have any information I can provide to you on that, but I would tell you that, the 2017 publication talks about, specifically is geared towards the identification aspect, which is outside the realm of what the CMTS is doing here with this guidance document.
Very good, thanks. I'm going to put in the chat window one of the questions that we received at registration that I think we are hopefully prepared to answer. It says, is there an approved permitting process yet for the movement or disposition of MEC that encumbers lease tracks and cable routes?
Yeah, thank you. I can take that one. So as we've kind of been referencing multiple times, that there isn't any clear specific authority over the movement or munitions operations of MECs specifically. So at this time, there isn't any agency that would be giving you a munitions permit. You're not going to be receiving a permit that explicitly says this permit allows you to move a munition. However, that the purpose of this guidance is to provide a safe process for going about those operations that might be related to your energy operations and under the permitting processes that is already approved related to those cable corridors or the placement of offshore wind turbines or other offshore energy facilities.
Very good, thanks. And we'll turn to one other pre-submitted question before we get to a question in the queue, which is, what is the scope of the EPA, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's authority as it relates to the relocation of UXO?
Yeah, thank you, Larry. I can take that one as well. So the EPA, like all of the other resource agencies that do have authority offshore, are going to retain their authority over the impacts to the marine environment as various operations do or do not create such impacts. So if a lessee decides to take out a munitions operations plan and there is an impact to the water column or marine mammals or some other, or air quality or something else, EPA or NOAA or any of these other agencies are going to have their authority under those existing regulations and those environmental procedures. And those are the same as any other operation offshore. As far as explicitly over the UXOs themselves, there isn't this clear authority as it's sitting on the seabed or the process of moving it. Perhaps one exception with the EPA is the relocation of the MEC for the construction operation is part of this construction plan. EPA doesn't have a clear permitting authority over that. What EPA does have authority over is ocean dumping. And so if a relocation of an MEC is farther than necessary to prevent hazards during construction of some sort of fixed structure, or doesn't seem to be done in a pre-construction or site preparation manner under a traditional offshore energy project, that disposal activity could become an ocean dumping activity, which would require an EPA permit.
What an alphabet soup we have here, don't we? Of different agencies that have to be involved. I appreciate you doing your best to explain that. Let me turn to a couple of questions in the queue. This one from Nick Townley says, it seems like the approval for low order in situ deflagration seems more prescriptive than a lift and shift remediation. Is there any estimate on the timing approval difference for deflagration would be, given inadvertent detonation can also occur with lift and shift as well? So distinguishing between low order in situ deflagration and a lift and shift remediation.
Yeah, so I wouldn't be able to provide you a timing difference, but what I would be able to say in particular, Nick, is that when we're thinking about this, part of the original concept actually came from something I was used to using when in my former Coast Guard career, which was in situ burns of oil. So in those type of situations, in the area contingency plans, all the expectations, if somebody wanted to burn oil as part of their response, would be stated there, the same way we've done so in the guidance. So that way industry knows what the expectations in that general framework are. But then you still have to customize that to that operational window that you're wanting to do, either a lift or shift or deflagration or any other thing else, to make sure it's appropriate fitting for, again, the environmental impact concerns as well as the weather windows. So as far as timing is concerned, we're wanting to make this guidance and expectation document very, very visible. So that way people can have these plans in place. And then at the time of operation, all they have to do is provide that color, if you will, to customize it for that operational window. So we're intending on this to be a very rapid evaluation.
Thanks, Jonathan. A question coming in from Michael Lewis. Has the Coast Guard or NOAA discussed the options for communicating the MEC hazards to the public, whether through charting or, in the case of numerous UXO, adding notes in the U.S. Coast Pilot? I'm so glad that Candace Nachman has a chance to take the microphone here.
Great, thanks. Yeah, it would be weird if I didn't, as the Coast Guard rep and also a former NOAA employee myself. But so the short answer is yes. And I'll also note that it is current policy. If the Coast Guard learns of the existence of an unexploded ordnance or a MEC from fishermen or whoever out there might find it, we always communicate that to NOAA so that they can appropriately chart it. We, as our task team, actually have also started having conversations with both NOAA and DOI, who co-lead the marine cadastre effort, to talk about doing a better job of making sure that the data that we have as far as locations of MEC are added as a layer in there as well. So we are very aware of the fact that more and more of these devices are being located, and the necessity to make sure that mariners are aware of them to ensure safety of life at sea.
Thank you so much, Candace. Michael or Jonathan, anything you wanted to add in supplementation, I should say? Thanks so much. Turning back to the queue, I have a question from Edward. In the phase 2 flowchart, Jonathan's favorite, the comments have been satisfied step is followed by lessee conducts munition response operation. Which agency exactly makes the decision that comments have been satisfied and the lessee may proceed?
So not to dodge the question, but it would not be a singular agency. This would be all of the participating agencies with their respective equities would evaluate that, and it would be a consensus that the comments have been satisfied.
Not received as a dodge, just a straightforward answer as best as you're able. Thanks, Edward, for the question. So at this point, we are standing by to see if other questions are in the offing. Again, if you want to drop it in the chat, you may. If you want to drop it in the Q&A box, you may. You also can raise your Zoom hand, or in the case of our caller, *9 to indicate you'd like to orally ask your question. I have to say, as I was telling some of my colleagues, these are remarkably interesting questions and from such a variety of different points of view. So I'm sure it's of great benefit to the team here to be able to field all of these and to help provide hopefully some good clarity as you consider comments in the Federal Register. So again, standing by for additional engagement from the attendees if you have questions that you feel haven't been answered and would like to pose them now. Might make sense while we're waiting to see if any other questions come in to just have, if Michael would be willing to have you cover our next steps that are going to follow this webinar. I don't know if Casey can bring us back the slide on that so that we can just cover that little bit of material while we wait and see if other questions are coming. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Larry. Yep. So as we've been saying, the guidance document is currently available on the Federal Register for public comment. That public comment period will close on September 25th. So we strongly encourage whatever comments you have as you're reading through these materials, new questions that might come up, issues that arise, please submit that formally in the Federal Register. We will be considering those in great detail and using that to potentially make any edits that need to be made to this document. Part of the benefit of this being a guidance document is that as events change and progress, and as this industry grows in the United States, this can be a living document that can be updated. It's also being done as a whole of government document through the CMTS. So this is not a single agency looking at it and then having a disagreement with someone else. We're trying to take a very whole of government approach to grow and provide the best guidance as issues change and as issues develop. Once we receive those comments and that closes and those are adjudicated, we will plan on having an industry tabletop session, bringing together government and industry to walk through scenarios, walk through the guidance and how the guidance would actually work in real time with various issues of increasing complexity, as we kind of alluded to earlier. And then we would use both the public comment period that we're receiving here, that industry tabletop exercise, to create the final guidance document, which, again, as Jonathan said, we hope to publish that as soon as we can, with taking the time that we need to make it the best document possible. Thank you, Larry.
Yeah, thanks very much, Michael. I'm going to shift back for a moment to a question that came in while you were speaking. This is from Scott Wilson. Is there a scenario that an emergency response could be generated just by the type of MEC and depth of water without the MEC being recovered on deck? Is there a scenario that an emergency response could be generated just by the type of MEC and depth of water without the MEC being recovered on deck?
Yeah, thank you, Larry, for that question. I think this would very much be a situation by situation determination, and ultimately up to the U.S. Coast Guard for what constitutes an emergency for them. If Candace, if you want to talk to that in more detail.
Great, thanks, Michael. Appreciate it. Right. So, I mean, I think again, it would be, what type of a threat is this MEC posing? Is there the potential for it to be pulled up or to cause some sort of emergency situation if it's not dealt with? But you know, I think for the most part, it really is more about making sure folks are aware of the location, and you know, we can do calls on security channels and things like that. But again, I think it would be a case-by-case basis, as Michael mentioned. Jonathan, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that this guidance has been developed for federal waters, so we're not generally talking about close proximity to, say, a public beach. If other folks, agencies chose to use this guidance as framework, there's no restriction of that, but this guidance was developed specifically for federal OCS activities.
Thanks, all three of you. Two other questions have popped up. In alignment with the previous question, will these procedures apply the same way for MEC with chemical components, such as mustard gas rounds?
Yeah, I can start with that one. So we did try to keep the guidance at a stage where it is a procedural guidance. It's going through a logical framework to create a risk analysis and then the best way to respond to that risk. A chemical munition is of course going to be a much greater risk, and that will impact the entire analysis from that stage forward. So at that stage, at that level, yes, it will operate in much the same way. While the level of scrutiny related to chemical weapons and of course the triggering of international treaty obligations related to chemical weapons will be different.
And a question from Michael Lewis on U.S. Coast Guard safety zones. While the guidance mentions safety zones issued by the sector commander, is this being considered at the Coast Guard district level for MEC on the Outer Continental Shelf?
Great, thanks, Michael, for your question. So I just want to mention that within the United States Coast Guard, we have an incredibly dedicated team of folks who are working on the issue of offshore wind in general. And that includes folks from headquarters as well as the districts and the sectors, many of whom of those dedicated professionals are on the call today listening in, actually. And so this guidance is something that we have shared within not only Coast Guard headquarters, but as well as at the districts and to disseminate more broadly. And so again, our procedures that we have at the Coast Guard, when we learn of a munition and explosive of concern in any situation, be it by an offshore wind developer, a fisherman, or whoever, those procedures are not changing as to how we continue to ensure safety at sea.
Very good. Thank you. Well, we have completed the questions that were sent to us in advance, as well as the questions in our queue. So I will pause once more to see if folks have anything additional they'd like to ask our distinguished panel, either through the Q&A window, the chat window, or by raising a hand. But then shortly, we will turn things over to Jonathan Frazier for some closing remarks. As a reminder, this will be posted, both the deck and the recording, on the CMTS website. And so if folks are wanting to go back and review anything that was discussed, they can do so there. And we will go ahead and turn things over to Jonathan for now without other questions immediately popping up.
Hey, thanks, Larry. Just want to say to everyone who's attended today's briefing, I really do appreciate your time and attention, and thank you very much for your patience. This has been a very complicated issue for us as a federal family to walk through. But, you know, we really appreciate the former head of the CMTS, Helen Broll, as well as Brian's support in this task team, and really just encourage anyone that if you have comments, please provide them, be detailed, and, you know, just help us make a good final product. As Michael said, you know, we also intend to hold the tabletop exercise, but also regularly make sure that we don't forget all the lessons learned. So as a federal partnership, we'll also be doing regular tabletops to make sure we can continue to exercise this guidance in a timely and efficient manner. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. I want to thank Brian Tetro, Michael Hurd-Snow, Jonathan Frazier, Candace Nachman from, as Jonathan put it, the federal family. I like that expression, for your tremendous work in not just this webinar, but of course on the guidance and the policy itself. And I do see one more question. Panelists, do you mind if I throw one more question your way? John says, to clarify, are we saying that the Coast Guard has authority to establish safety zones that are not directly related to outer continental shelf structures, as the new authority seems limited to? So are we saying the Coast Guard has authority to establish safety zones not related to outer continental shelf structures?
Oh, yeah, thanks for asking that clarifying question. Appreciate it. No, so the Coast Guard has the ability through captain of the port authorities to establish temporary safety zones as necessary. Additionally, you know, through the Channel 16 security calls, can make folks aware of, you know, if there were to be an active MEC remediation or movement activity, to make folks aware so that they stay out of a certain area while that activity is ongoing.
And just emphasize, like Candace said, this would be a temporary safety zone for the operation itself. Everything else, when it comes to the general location, they would plot it, make sure that's aware for the public, but there would not be an established permanent safety zone for that.
Thanks for that clarification, Jonathan.
Yeah, and thanks to both of you for the answer, and to our question asker, all of our question askers. Again, I just want to commend the level of detail and thoughtfulness that's gone into these questions, nearly 24 in all. So certainly a fruitful exercise all around. So again, thanks to our panel, thanks to Casey Hoffman and Morgan Nachman with me at Kearns and West, helping to ensure a smooth and productive session today. Again, Morgan is compiling notes that will be available in the future on the CMTS site. And thanks to Casey for all of the technical support. You can see in the chat window an email address that you can use for additional questions, offshore.energy@cmts.gov. cmts.gov. That's offshore.energy@cmts.gov. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we'll be in touch.